Content warning: this story involves crimes against children. Most people think cases like these are about crime. They're not. They're about something far more uncomfortable. The moment where nothing looks wrong, but something already is, and by the time anyone notices, it's too late. The first case began with someone no one expected to fear. A 10-year-old girl sat in a courtroom in Newcastle. No one in that room reacted the same way they normally would, not because of noise, but because of how still everything felt. Even the adults had stopped moving naturally. Some were staring at papers they weren't reading. Some avoided looking at the center of the room entirely. And in the middle of it all, she just sat there, not looking for anyone, not reacting to anyone. Mary Bell. There was something about the silence that didn't match her age, not loud fear, not confusion, just stillness that didn't shift. And no one said it out loud, but everyone noticed it. She had come from a childhood that didn't feel stable in any consistent way. Not one single event defines it. It was more about what didn't exist around her. Things that usually shape how children respond to the world weren't consistent in her environment. And that shows up later in ways people don't immediately recognize. Not in obvious behavior, in smaller patterns, like how she didn't respond the same way to people across different moments, or how reactions that should have been predictable weren't. A boy named Martin Brown was later found in an abandoned building. At first, the situation didn't have a clear explanation. Nothing immediately pointed in one direction. It stayed unclear long enough that people thought it might remain that way. But then the investigation didn't stay in one place. It expanded, slowly at first, then more focused. A nearby nursery school was broken into. Inside, something unusual was found. Not violence, not damage in the way people expected, but written markings, childlike handwriting that didn't belong in that setting. That detail changed the direction of the case without anyone announcing it. Because now the question wasn't just what happened, it was what kind of pattern was forming. Mary Bell's name appeared in early questioning, not as accusation at first, more like connection points investigators were trying to understand. When she was questioned, she didn't react in ways that created clarity. No visible fear, no breakdown, no emotional explanation, just short answers, controlled tone, same expression throughout, and that consistency created more questions than answers. At some point, another child was found under similar circumstances. And now the situation wasn't isolated anymore, it was connecting. That's when fear shifted shape. Not dramatic panic, but uncertainty, because no one could see the full structure yet, only fragments. During interviews, investigators expected emotional shifts. They didn't happen in a predictable way. Responses stayed steady across pressure points, not increasing, not decreasing, just unchanged. And that gap between expectation and reality became impossible to ignore. At trial, the courtroom didn't feel normal. It felt slower, heavier, more cautious. No one reacted immediately to arguments. Silence stretched longer than expected. The case wasn't just about responsibility, it was about interpretation. How to understand behavior that didn't fit normal assumptions, but nothing resolved that tension cleanly. Eventually, the decision came. Manslaughter due to diminished responsibility, not murder. A legal conclusion that still left emotional uncertainty unresolved. She was placed into secure care. Not typical correctional placement, but long-term supervision, controlled observation. Years passed. Her identity was changed, her public presence removed, released later under anonymity. No public trace, no visible identity, but the case didn't fade because the question stayed, not in the courtroom, but in interpretation. Later reviews focused on patterns, not single explanations, how reactions didn't always align with expectations, not dramatic signs, just differences in response patterns over time. And that made classification difficult even decades later. One image stayed in reports: a child sitting still in a courtroom full of uneasy adults. No movement that felt natural for the moment, just stillness in the center of attention. That image stayed longer than the case itself. Years later, Mary Bell lived under full anonymity. No public presence, no confirmed identity exposure. A life disconnected from the courtroom she once sat in. But the case never became a simple explanation. It stayed open to interpretation, because the uncomfortable part was never just what happened, it was how early things can shift without being noticed, and how by the time patterns are recognized, they may have already formed. And that's where the silence of this case still sits, not in what was proven, but in what was never fully understood in real time. And now, we move to our next case. A quiet American neighborhood. No warning signs, no alarms, no suspicion. And then, a 15-year-old boy is arrested for multiple brutal murders. But the terrifying part wasn't what he did. It was how long he was already doing it, unnoticed. Warwick, Rhode Island, 1987. A place where life moved slowly. Neighbors knew each other. Doors stayed unlocked longer than they should. Nothing about this town suggested it was hiding a serial killer, and certainly not one who was still in high school. But sometimes, danger doesn't arrive from outside. It grows inside the system itself. The investigation began after a horrifying discovery inside a home. 4 victims, a mother, her 2 daughters, and a family friend. The scene was not random. It was targeted, personal, controlled. Detectives immediately knew this wasn't a burglary gone wrong. This was something else, something experienced. But here's where the case takes a turn no one expected. This wasn't the first time. 2 years earlier, another woman had already been murdered in the same area. And investigators later realized something disturbing. The pattern was similar, too similar. But back then, no one connected the dots because the suspect was a child. Craig Price didn't fit the image of a killer. He went to school, he interacted with people, he lived at home like any other teenager, but behind that ordinary surface, something had already escalated. When detectives brought him in, they expected confusion, fear, denial, shock. What they got instead was calm. Too calm. He answered questions without hesitation, without emotion, without resistance. And that's when investigators realized something unsettling. This wasn't his first time under serious suspicion. As the interrogation deepened, Craig's involvement became clearer. Evidence tied him directly to the scene. But what disturbed investigators wasn't just physical proof. It was the absence of emotional reaction. No remorse, no panic, no breakdown, just detachment. As if the consequences belonged to someone else entirely. And then came the part that changed everything. Authorities discovered Craig had a prior violent incident history as a minor, not fully understood at the time, not properly addressed. A warning sign that had already passed through the system, unnoticed. Because Craig was under 18, the justice system faced a dilemma. How do you process adult-level violence? From a juvenile offender? The case forced legal debate across Rhode Island. Eventually, he was tried as a juvenile, leading to a controversial sentence and long-term detention. But the public question never disappeared. Was this a failure of law or a failure of early intervention? Because when someone reaches that level of violence so young, the real question isn't what happened during the crime. It's what happened before anyone noticed anything was wrong. And how many chances were missed along the way. Craig Price remains one of the most disturbing juvenile cases in American criminal history, not because of one moment, but because of how long the warning signs existed before they were ever understood. And that's what makes this case difficult to forget. Next, we go to 1800s America, where a 14-year-old boy stood in a courtroom and forced an entire country to confront a question no one wanted to answer: can someone be born this way? A 14-year-old boy sat in a courtroom full of adults, and the silence wasn't normal, because it wasn't what he had done that disturbed them most. It was how calmly he sat there after it. Boston, Massachusetts, 1874. The courtroom was crowded, but unusually still. No movement, no side conversations, just eyes fixed on one person, Jesse Pomeroy. He didn't look threatening, he didn't look dangerous, and that was exactly the problem, because everyone in that room already knew what he was accused of, but nothing about his presence matched the accusations. And that mismatch created discomfort no one could explain. Jesse grew up in Massachusetts in the mid-1800s. On paper, his childhood looked ordinary, but people around him described something harder to define. He didn't respond to things the way other children did, not loudly, not visibly, but internally. Something seemed absent. He wasn't socially aggressive. He wasn't expressive. He often stayed alone, not just physically, but emotionally separated. And that distance never seemed to close. By age 12, something started changing in Boston. Reports began surfacing of young boys being approached, not randomly attacked, but carefully spoken to, guided away, removed from attention. At first, nothing connected them. Different locations, different times, different circumstances, but slowly, a pattern started forming. And patterns like that create fear faster than certainty, because fear grows in what you can't predict. Parents began noticing something unsettling. It wasn't just what happened, it was a possibility that it could happen again, anywhere, to anyone. And that uncertainty changed the entire atmosphere of the city. When investigators finally brought Jesse in, they didn't expect clarity. They expected confusion, fear, denial, something emotionally unstable. But that's not what they saw. He answered questions directly. No hesitation, no visible emotional reaction, no shift in expression, just calm responses. Too calm. And that calmness didn't feel normal. It felt detached from the situation itself. As questioning continued, Jesse didn't break character. He didn't show panic. He didn't show confusion. He simply responded as if it didn't involve him emotionally. Eventually, he acknowledged involvement in multiple incidents. But what unsettled investigators wasn't the confession. It was the absence of emotional weight behind it. No fear, no regret, no visible understanding of consequence, just information delivered without reaction. Inside the courtroom, that became the central conflict, not just guilt or innocence, but interpretation. One side argued he didn't fully understand what he was doing, that something in his development had gone wrong. The other side disagreed completely. They pointed to planning, consistency, control, two completely opposite interpretations, fighting over the same child. And neither explanation felt fully satisfying, because both answers created different kinds of fear. Jesse was initially sent to a reform school. The idea was simple: restore behavior and reintegrate later. But that plan didn't hold. His mother pushed for his release, and eventually the system agreed. He was released. But the city didn't feel the same after that decision. Something stayed unresolved, like a warning not fully understood. Soon after, reports began surfacing again. 2 children went missing in Boston, not immediately connected, not immediately understood. Then fear returned when patterns reappeared. Suspicion moved faster this time. Investigators traced timelines, locations, overlaps, and the pattern pointed back to one place: Jesse Pomeroy. When authorities searched a linked location, they found evidence that changed everything. Not speculation, not assumption, something concrete. He was arrested again, and this time, there was no uncertainty about severity. At just 14 years old, he stood trial for murder. Inside the courtroom, the debate deepened. It became psychological, human, uncomfortable. One side argued he lacked emotional development. The other argued he understood fully. And that awareness itself was disturbing. Not confusion, not ignorance, but interpretation of control. And that's what made the divide so intense, because both sides were describing different realities from the same behavior. Eventually, the verdict came: guilty. The sentence: death. A 14-year-old boy sentenced to execution. But even that wasn't the end. The governor intervened. The sentence was reduced to life imprisonment. Jesse was placed into isolation. Not temporary, not short-term, but decades of separation from normal human contact. Years passed, then decades. Inside prison, reports stayed consistent: calm behavior, controlled responses, minimal emotional change. Not improved, not worsened, just unchanged. And that consistency became its own form of discomfort, because time was expected to change something, but it didn't. He remained in prison for over 4 decades until his death in 1932, at age 72. But even after his death, the question didn't disappear, because if a child can develop into something like this without anyone recognizing when it began, then the real concern isn't the outcome. It's the moment before it begins, when nothing looks wrong yet. And that's what makes this case difficult to leave behind. Next, we move to India, where an 8-year-old boy's case would force an entire country to rethink childhood itself. An 8-year-old boy linked to multiple deaths, no clear motive, no panic, no explanation. And when he was questioned, what he said made it worse. Content warning: this story involves crimes against children. In 2007, a remote village in Bihar, India, became the center of a case that didn't spread quickly, but stayed with the people who studied it. Because this wasn't just about what happened, it was about what didn't happen. The village was called Mushahar, extreme poverty, families surviving day to day, very little structure, very little oversight. Problems here didn't escalate, they disappeared. Amarjit Sada grew up in that environment. Large family, constant financial pressure, long hours where children were left on their own. Nothing about him stood out at first. He blended in, until one day, something didn't. In 2006, when he was around 7 years old, his aunt left her infant daughter in the family's care. She had to travel for work. At one point, Amarjit's mother stepped out to the market. For a short time, the house was quiet, just him and 2 babies. And then something changed. When the mother came back, the room didn't feel normal. No crying, no movement, no sound at all. The baby wasn't responding. Not restless, not sick, just still. That silence didn't match the situation, and that's what made it unsettling. But what followed mattered even more. No police call, no questions, no outside help. The family made a decision: not out of cruelty, but fear. In that environment, reporting something like this didn't just bring attention, it could destroy everything: reputation, work, social standing. So they controlled the story. An illness, an accident, something easier to live with, but silence has a cost. Months later, it happened again. Same house, same conditions, another infant. This time, Amarjit's younger sister. Again, no clear struggle, just a sudden absence of life. And now, the pattern was harder to ignore. Some family members began to suspect something, not openly, not directly, but enough to feel it. And still, no one stepped forward because speaking up meant consequences. And consequences felt more dangerous than the truth. That choice is what allowed everything to continue. It stayed hidden until 2007. A 6-month-old baby named Kushbu disappeared from a nearby school. This time, silence wasn't an option. Search efforts, questions, panic. During the investigation, one detail kept coming up. A witness had seen Amarjit near the school that day. He was brought in for questioning. An 8-year-old sitting across from investigators. They expected confusion, denial, fear. What they got was the opposite. He didn't resist questions. He didn't look confused. He didn't avoid anything. He just answered directly, calmly. He spoke about the missing child, then went further. The earlier deaths, the ones never reported. No hesitation, no visible guilt, just information without emotional shift. That's what stayed with investigators. Not just what he said, but how he said it, as if he wasn't fully connected to it, or worse, as if it didn't feel wrong. Psychologists later described something more unsettling: absence, no clear understanding of right and wrong, no emotional reaction, no empathy response. That's what made this case different. It didn't fit a simple explanation: environment, neglect, psychology, or something harder to define. Legally, there wasn't much room. Too young for adult sentencing, so he was placed in juvenile care. He stayed until 18. In 2016, he was released. New identity, no public tracking. He stepped back into society without anyone knowing who he was. And that's the part that still lingers, because today, he could be anyone, somewhere, living a normal life on the surface. No one around him knows his past. No one recognizes the name, and that contrast creates discomfort. Because if something like this can exist that early and then disappear into normal life, how would you ever know? And more importantly, what if this wasn't an isolated case? A toddler was inside a shopping center in Liverpool. Everything looked normal. People were walking past, talking, living their moment, like nothing unusual existed in it. He was holding his mother's hand, close enough that nothing about it felt unsafe. Nothing about it felt temporary. She looked away, just for a second, not long enough to expect consequences, not long enough to feel worried. When she looked back, he wasn't there anymore. James Bulger, 2 years old, gone inside a place full of people who didn't immediately realize anything had changed, and for a few seconds, nothing reacted. Not the crowd, not the space, not the moment itself. Then awareness started forming, slowly, unevenly, like the mind refusing to accept what it just missed. CCTV footage came later, not with urgency, just review. Then review again and again. 2 children appear, walking through the shopping center. No urgency, no hiding. A toddler between them, moving like it belongs there. People pass by. Some glance, some don't. And that detail matters more later than it does in the moment. Not what they did, but how many people saw it and kept walking, step after step, corridor after corridor. Nothing breaks the sequence. Not once in a way the mind can clearly mark as, this should have stopped here. And that's where discomfort starts forming. Not in action, but in continuation. At some point, the environment changes, less crowded, less noise, less attention, and still, they keep going. Walton Railway Area, a place where public attention naturally fades. What happens there later doesn't translate cleanly into words. It feels like something stretched and then stopped. And after that point, nothing continues the same way again. 2 days later, the discovery is made and everything shifts instantly, not gradually, completely, because now it is no longer about disappearance. It is about responsibility. CCTV is watched again, but differently this time. Not for information, for understanding. And now the same footage feels heavier because the ending is already known. 2 children, walking, a toddler between them, through a space that never stopped them. This time, normality doesn't feel normal anymore. Police release images, responses begin coming in, fragments, leading to 2 boys absent from school that day. When they are brought in, there is no immediate reaction that defined the situation, no panic, no clarity, no emotional explosion, just silence. Short answers, long pauses. At first, denial, then shifts. Not stable, not complete. And that instability becomes more important than anything said, because truth usually holds steady under pressure. Here, it didn't. Both boys came from unstable environments. But that explanation doesn't close the case, because instability exists in many lives. Outcomes like this do not. Courtroom, 1993. Controlled atmosphere, heavy silence, statements are made, silence follows, extended silence, evidence is shown, reactions arrive late, as if the room is always a few seconds behind reality. Prosecution focuses on intent, defense on development, but neither removes a central tension, because the real question stays unchanged. How does something like this form at that age? And nothing in that room fully answers it. Verdict, guilty. Detention at Her Majesty's pleasure. But even after the verdict, the case doesn't feel finished. It shifts into memory. Years later, both are released under anonymity. New identities, no public trace. Their lives continue separately. But the case remains fixed in public memory. Because what people remember most is not the ending. It is the walk. 2 children moving through a public space without interruption, without recognition of what was unfolding. And that image doesn't fade, because it doesn't rely on violence or noise. It relies on normality. And that is what makes it stay longer than explanation ever could. Not what happened at the end, but how long it continued before anything finally stopped it. And that is where it stays. Not as a conclusion, but as something the mind doesn't fully put down. For most people watching these cases, there is always a point where things start to feel connected. Not immediately, not clearly, but slowly. Different names, different places, different years. But the pattern underneath doesn't change in the way people expect it to. Something happens before anyone realizes anything has started happening. And by the time it becomes visible, it is already complete. In every case, there is always a normal moment before everything shifts. And that moment never looks important at the time. A shopping center, a street, a classroom, a home. Nothing about it signals what it will become later. And that is where the discomfort begins, not in what happened, but in what didn't look like anything at all when it was happening. Across all these cases, the explanations exist, but they don't close the feeling they leave behind, because explanation and emotional acceptance are not the same thing. One explains, the other stays unresolved, and the most difficult part is not any single event. It is the gap between what was visible and what only became visible afterward. Because that gap always exists in every case, just never in a way that feels obvious at the time. And once that is noticed, it becomes harder to ignore in other places too. Not because everything is connected, but because nothing looks as clear in real time as it does in hindsight. And that is what stays, not the events themselves, but the realization that clarity always arrives too late to prevent understanding. And even then, it doesn't fully complete the picture, it only makes it harder to stop thinking about it. Because some questions don't stay in the moment they are asked. They continue long after the moment has ended. Not loudly, not clearly, but consistently. And that is where these stories end. Not in answers, but in the part of the mind that keeps trying to find one, even when there isn't one. That feels complete. Okay, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the video. For more videos, make sure to like the video and subscribe to my channel. Thank you, really.